So what makes a horror game scary? It's a question that can also be asked about horror movies, because as we know, it's one thing to have a game or a movie categorized as horror. It's another thing to have a genuinely scary game or movie. But in answering the question, is this game or movie scary? Do we have to answer it the same way depending on whether it is a game or a movie? In other words, is a horror game scary in a different way that a movie is scary? Does there have to be a difference? If we were answering that question back in 1999, the year that the movie The Blair Witch Project was released, the answer would probably be yes. If you look at some of the best horror games of the 1990s like Silent Hill and Resident Evil, those games may have borrowed some elements from movies like Night of the Living Dead and The Shining, but they didn't look like those movies. What was scary about those games had a lot to do with their limited perspectives on the action, clunky movements, and awkward dialogue.
Oh! I can't believe it! Are you okay?
Yeah, so much for him. We got to the root of the problem.
Now, 20 years later, the two media, movies and games, have grown increasingly similar. And with the release of a game based on the Blair Witch franchise in 2019, it's a fair comparison to make over which is scarier. Looking at clips from both, it's hard to tell the difference sometimes. On a superficial level, you could say that the Blair Witch game is extremely faithful to the original movie. But as we see when we look a little closer and actually play the Blair Witch game, the differences are clear. Even though Bloober Team, the designers, and Lionsgate released this game as a canonical entry into the Blair Witch franchise, the game actually undoes what the original movie accomplished. Comparing the two, we can see how the game removes the horror of the original and replaces it with a supernatural suspense thriller. Playing the game is a tense experience, but when it's over, there isn't that lingering sense of horror that you get from the ending of the Blair Witch Project. So let's start there with the original movie. I think we'd all agree that not seeing the Blair Witch in the movie made it much scarier than if we had seen it. But we can be more precise about this. The fact that the characters did see the Blair Witch, and we didn't, is part of what makes it scary. At the end of the movie, Heather comes down into the basement of the house to see Mike standing against the wall. Someone else, or something else, is down there with them. And that someone, or something, told Mike to stand against the wall, and then attacks Heather. The filmmakers hide the monster from the audience, but not from the characters. We can only imagine what Mike and Heather saw, or heard, or felt. And whatever that is much scarier than whatever the filmmakers could have put on the screen. This is not an original idea, of course. Since the 1930s, movie makers figured out that you don't really need expensive costumes or makeup or special effects to make a monster if you had scary sound design. The audience can fill in the rest.
Children of the night, what music they make.
Did you hear that baby scream?
Yes.
Shut the fuck up. There's no fucking baby out there, man. There's no fucking baby out there. Okay.
That's what makes horror such a great genre for radio plays. And it's not like you have to hide the monsters from the characters as well, although that can be pretty effective, like in the movie Cat People, when you have a character who can't see the monster but can hear it, and the audience is put in the position of that character and can only hear what the character hears. Showing us reactions to unseen monsters can be much scarier than showing the monsters themselves. And then there are variations on seen versus unseen. Like in the movie Alien, the characters often see the monster, but we're only given suggestions of what that thing actually looks like. A really effective variation is having an off-screen victim attacked by the monster while an on-screen character is reacting to the attack. Like in this early scene from the movie The Leopard Man, where a mother inside a house doesn't believe that her daughter is being attacked by a cat monster outside the house until it's too late. The Blair Witch Project plays around with this idea of the unseen monster, blending it with cinema verite documentary styles to make the audience part of the action. We can only see what's in front of these two cameras when they're being operated, but Heather, Mike, and Josh saw a lot more than what we can see through those cameras.
I'm coming. My boots aren't laced. Oh my God, what the fuck is that? What the fuck is that?
So what did they see? Our imagination has to fill that in, and it's no wonder that so many people complained about the movie, saying that it's just a bunch of hype with no payoff.
Okay, they're in the woods. The camera keeps on moving. I think they're looking for some witch or something. I don't know. I wasn't listening.
With absolutely zero evidence of an actual Blair Witch on the screen, the movie left open the possibility that perhaps there was no witch at all. A plausible theory of the movie, in fact, is that Josh committed the murders after having a psychotic breakdown in the woods. With this in mind, you'd think a video game, especially a video game made 20 years later, would be a great medium for this idea, combining camera perspective with audience interactivity. You can play a character lost in the woods, where every photorealistic sight and sound could be the witch, and your goal is to escape the woods alive. The game does some of this, and does a fairly good job of building a sense of dread in the player, which I'll say more about a little later. But horror, not so much. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the Blair Witch game removes all of the horror that was in the movie. And it does this by over-explaining the player character, Ellis, as a psychologically disturbed war veteran who turns into a monster. It closes off our imagination rather than stimulating it, and its gameplay mechanics, as much as they try to horrify the player, succeed only in frustrating the player. But let's start with the good stuff, the way the game opens. We have a cinematic sequence of Ellis driving up to the forest with his dog, named Bullet. We hear a news report on the radio about a boy named Peter who went missing in the forest. It's the year 1996, 2 years after the events of the Blair Witch Project. The dread continues in the low-key opening of the actual game, where we switch from third-person to first-person perspective and do some exploration. We are reminded of the period, the mid-1990s, with cell phone technology. I spent a couple of minutes nostalgically clicking through the functions of my cell phone, choosing a menu graphic and sampling its other content. I never looked at these again, there's really no reason to, but they're a nice touch. And once we're done exploring this outside area of the forest and we're inside the forest, it's a very creepy walking simulator. Something about being alone in a forest conjures up scary imaginings. In a typical horror movie set in a woodsy area, urban protagonists go deep into the woods where they shouldn't go, and the monsters are in there, waiting for the sun to go down and for the travelers to lose their sense of direction. The Blair Witch game promises this, and delivers that, but the promise is usually better than the delivery. Whenever it introduces a new location, like a sawmill, a ravine, and of course the iconic house at the end, the game builds a sense of dread in the player. This is due to having very limited light sources, a lot of creepy sound effects and music cues, and of course that first-person camera perspective. The game conjures up a scary mood and a chilling atmosphere. Other games do this quite well, of course, and in different settings. The house in Resident Evil 7, the Institute in Metro Exodus. Sevastopol Station in Alien Isolation. This is one thing games can do that movies cannot do, which is put the player in control of a first-person perspective of a character in a terrifying environment. Even though our instinct is to get out of there as soon as possible, the game forces us to stay and face the monster. Unfortunately, unlike these other games, the Blair Witch game can't sustain these effects. Part of the problem is that it gives the player so little interactivity with the environment and with other characters. It didn't have to be like this. As it's established in this little area outside of the woods in the opening of the game, there's a whole search party out there, led by a sheriff named Lanning. The people in this party communicate by walkie-talkie, and they have personalities and attitudes. But after they're introduced, they all but disappear from the narrative, even though the whole plot of the game is built around this search for the missing boy Peter. Ellis thinks he can find Peter on his own, before anyone else in the search party. It's the kind of silly ambition that motivated Heather, Mike, and Josh in the Blair Witch Project. They thought that their amateur documentary about a local legend would launch their careers as independent filmmakers. As the movie shows, the joke is on them, as much as it is on Ellis, who thinks he can single-handedly solve this mystery and rescue Peter. But there's no real reason for Ellis to be so isolated from the rest of the search party. Why does he have to find Peter all by himself? He could have started the game with the search party and had some direct interactions with them. The game could then establish his character through these interactions, making us care about him a little more, and then at some point he could break off on his own for whatever reason. Instead, the game insists from the very beginning that he avoid human contact, except for these awkward exchanges over his cell phone and walkie-talkie. This is so the game can locate the horror somewhere between the creepy woods where Ellis is and Ellis's troubled past as a soldier in the Gulf War. The problem is that we don't really care about Ellis's past so much because he's not really doing anything particularly interesting in the present. That just leaves us with some creepy woods and a few creepy buildings and a lot of backstory that takes forever to reveal itself. One more positive note before we talk about this backstory and how it ruins this game. Ellis has an animal companion, a dog named Bullet. And although it would have been much better for Ellis to have a human companion, this dog is actually the best part of the game. Nothing about the dog is particularly scary or elevates the horror, but it shows the cleverness of the game designers to combine a lot of different gameplay mechanics into this one character. And the dog is a character, in some ways a better character than Ellis. Some of the dog's characteristics can be chosen by the player at the start, like the color of his coat and his collar. Since a lot of this game takes place at night in dark spaces, I chose the brightest colors that I could. You have to be able to see this dog if you want to progress. I mean, look at how lost you'd be in this dark area of the forest without this glowing collar to show you the way. There are no maps or mini-maps in this game, which is to its credit. It really does help us to immerse ourselves into the setting without maps or mini-maps. And the game generates a lot of suspense as we follow this animal and trust that at least he knows where he's going. Along with directional navigation, the dog also functions as a combat assistant. I use the phrase combat a little loosely here, but what else do we call play sections where we are being attacked by a fast-moving demon, and our only weapon is our flashlight? There's some confusion here about why the light is so damaging. There was a similar mechanic in the game Alan Wake, where light from a flashlight lowers the defenses of enemies, while more conventional weapons like guns take the enemies down. But here you don't really have a gun or really any kind of conventional weapon. The premise is that the demon witches don't like to be seen, and so I guess a light from a flashlight, quote, damages them. This is explained a little bit in a voice recording left by a serial killer named Carver, who speaks in a creepy Will Patton-like voice.
The light. It keeps them away. Keeps me safe. Need to hold on to the light.
But now, if we're in the dark and the demons are running around, how do we know where to point the flashlight? That's where the dog comes in. The dog senses a demon's location and turns and barks in that direction, and if we turn in the same direction, our flashlight does some damage. In that respect, the dog functions like a turret in a turret combat section of a game, except you can't really control the direction of the turret, just yourself in relation to the turret's direction. This does get a little tiresome after a while, after the demon takes like 3 or 4 hits, and you feel a little stupid, basically parking yourself behind a dog's ass to ward off enemies with a flashlight. But it gives the dog another function besides navigation. And it's nice to know that we don't have to protect the dog during these combat sequences. In a way, the dog is protecting us, which helps us build an attachment to him. And this leads to the third and most complicated role that the dog plays. He is our one and only friendly companion. And this is where the game tries to build Ellis's character through player choice. The game opens with this ominous statement, "Your humanity will be judged." It further tells us that the way we treat the dog will have an impact on story events. Now, why this is never really explained. I guess the designers simply assume that all players universally love dogs. We are encouraged to do good things for the dog. Not that I'm not a dog person, I just didn't find this game's moral judgment meter all that compelling. It's not a role-playing game. In a horror story, characters make bad decisions and suffer the consequences. The character Ellis is supposed to be driven to utter madness and murderous rage, and there's no way out of that, no matter how you treat the dog. At one point, the serial killer Carver shows up to give Ellis a gun, the only time that Ellis has a gun in the game, and tells Ellis to shoot Bullet with the gun. You figure this is one of those moments where your humanity is being judged. And so of course I refused, and Ellis throws the gun away. If you think about it, Ellis was the biggest threat to Bullet's life. Even the decision to take Bullet into the forest all by itself put the dog's life in jeopardy. If Ellis was a moral person, he would have thought of Bullet's safety and left him at home, and also joined the search party. But I'm glad I had the dog with me. He was helpful and fun to have around. He seemed alive in a way my own character Ellis wasn't. I think the game missed an opportunity to make Bullet himself a source of horror. I would have been much more frightened by the idea, let's say, of the dog becoming possessed if you didn't treat him right. That would probably make that moral judgment meter a lot more dramatic. They could have even railroaded that in, where no matter how you treated Bullet, by the end of the game he will turn on you. And now you don't just have the Blair Witch flying around, but now you've got Cujo snapping at your rear end. Instead, the dog is part of a conventional judgment mechanic that is more sentimental than scary. And that's the bigger problem with the game's depiction of Ellis, the main character. It's a sentimental portrait of a troubled soul experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. Although this can be horrific, the Blair Witch game is entirely structured around backstory revelations, giving the plot more of a mystery structure. There's more suspense over what we might learn about Ellis's past, and not so much about what scary, horrifying things are happening in the present. This could have been structured differently. The backstory could have been presented to us much earlier, even in just the beginning of the game as part of the pre-game cinematic. But no, we just get hints and teases and vague references throughout to Ellis's past, through dialogue like this.
Did you hear about the missing kid? I'm joining the search.
Oh, wow. Okay. You think that's a good idea?
Why wouldn't it be?
You know why?
Or visually with fragments of flashbacks like these cut-ins of someone's eyes, and sound effects like helicopters and gunfire.
Gotten this far. Not giving up now.
which are woven into the soundtrack at various points. These things keep popping in and out with no further explanation. It's simply maddening how the game keeps all of this backstory a secret from the player. What is the point of this, of keeping it such a secret? It's not a secret to Ellis, or to Jess, who is his now separated wife, or to anyone in that search party, or even to the Blair Witch. Everyone in this game but the player knows what happened in the past. So as we are playing Ellis in narrative terms, we are making choices based on total ignorance of what it might mean to Ellis. I never really understood his reactions to things. Like early in the game when he finds some trash in the forest. He's pretty angry about it.
Well, the world's not your goddamn trash can.
The anger seems a bit extreme, but where is it coming from? Is he an environmentalist? Does he have anger management problems? Is this part of the health issues that other characters are talking about? Here and there, Ellis finds little bunches of twigs, like in the movie, and the player can grab them, crush them, and reveal a Polaroid photo of a Blair Witch victim inside. As it turns out, this is one of the ways in which the game is judging our humanity. Meaning, if the player chose not to crush any of those twigs, the ending would actually be a happier one. But when Ellis finds trash, he picks it up and takes it with him, presumably to dispose of it later. Why wouldn't he collect these photos or these totems that he finds, rather than leave them there to pollute the environment? Touching a coffee cup, that's okay. Touching a photo and a wooden carving, not okay. Then there are these collectible military dog tags in the game world that Ellis can pick up, and they are clearly evidence that we're in an alternate parallel universe where fragments of Ellis's past have been strewn around for him to pick up and remember. But remember what? He expresses surprise at seeing some of them.
How the hell did they get here?
But we don't learn until later what the significance of these dog tags is. These are the soldiers who died in the ambush in Iraq that Ellis somehow survived. Picking up these dog tags, however, doesn't have any impact on the ending, so there's absolutely no reason to pick them up or not. Now a bit more about this backstory. This teasing of information about Ellis's past creates confusion and frustration. It's not just one big dramatic event from the past that's being replayed to us in different ways. It's actually several events that happen at different times. Along with the ambush in Iraq, there was Ellis's murder of a young Iraqi woman. The game tries to be suggestive about this, giving the player clues and hints that can be pieced together, like those flash cuts to a close-up of a woman's eyes. We think, well, this might be Jess, whose face is blurred out in some flashbacks, but it turns out to be this woman that Ellis killed in the war. So we have an ambush, a murder, and then on top of that there is a shooting at a convenience store after Ellis came home from the war. This flashback appears as a news report and as a first-person memory of Ellis's. A kid had robbed the store and was just leaving the store when Ellis shoots him dead, even though the kid was unarmed. This kid turns out to be the older brother of Peter, the boy who went missing. And this is supposed to explain why Ellis is so hell-bent on finding Peter all by himself. But if you think about it, I don't know what Ellis expects to get out of this. I mean, if you look at it from Peter's point of view, let's say he is rescued by Ellis. I'm sure he'd be happy to be rescued by anyone. But would he be especially happy to be rescued by the man who killed his brother? I don't think Ellis really thought this one through. The more the game tries to explain Ellis with this backstory, the wider the gap is between the player's perspective and that of the designers. We accept that Ellis is in a parallel dimension of time and space, where he's experiencing fragments of the past in the present. We can even accept that Ellis may be suffering from schizophrenia. What is hard to accept, though, is the way backstory information is withheld from us to the point where, when it's finally revealed, the revelation has little to no impact. By the time we figure out what happened in Iraq and what happened at the convenience store, so much of the reality of the game world has been twisted and violated that we could just dismiss all of it as projections of a disturbed mind, or maybe even false memories that are planted into Ellis by the Blair Witch.
What the hell is wrong with this forest?
What if it's not the forest, Ellis? Maybe it's all in your head.
It's a narrative mess, this game. When Ellis gets a text message from the spirit world, are we to assume that we're in the alternate dimension? Or is this some intrusion of the supernatural into the natural world through technology? And what about Bullet? Is the dog ever part of the supernatural world? If so, when? And if not, why not? We could go on all day poking holes into the logic of the supernatural in the Blair Witch game, and you could probably do that really with any work of fantasy. But in this game, even after we've exhausted all of the super picky questions about how the Blair Witch can do this or that, a bigger question remains. If Ellis's backstory is so important, if it is the key to understanding his character, why is it withheld from us for so long if we are playing that character? Either tell us up front so we understand who we're playing and make choices based on that backstory, or just don't tell us at all and just embrace the mysterious, which in its own way would enhance the horror of the game. In this case, though, the result is a horror game for people who really don't like horror games. A walking simulator with puzzles. The challenge of the puzzles is pretty light. You have to fix a car, operate a winch, turn on generators, etc. in order to progress. These puzzles are pretty easy to figure out. The game tells you what to fix, where to get the parts you need, and how to fix it. More challenging and enjoyable puzzles involve the camcorder that you're given. This camcorder has the magical ability to alter the game world. Various tapes are strewn around the area, and based on their recorded footage, the player can reverse time. So, like in this case, if a fallen tree is preventing Ellis from continuing on, playing back a conveniently placed videotape of the tree falling can reverse time and put that tree back up so the player can move forward. How this fits into a horror narrative, I have no idea, but it's a fun gimmick. Later on in the game, the view screen of the camcorder is used as a magical filter to highlight directional cues in white so the player knows where to go. In a sense, the camcorder at this time replaces the dog as the directional indicator. The camcorder also highlights the presence of some demons in red, who will kill Ellis if he looks at them. This is actually pretty effective in creating some anxiety for the player, like in this moment when Ellis has to turn his back on the demons and just slip by them slowly in the dark. Just watching this playback footage makes me nervous. I think the game cheats a little bit with this mechanic. Like during this particular challenge, I swear I was not looking at those demons, and they killed Ellis anyway, several times. Anyway, a little trial and error gets you through it. The most frustrating part of this game, however, that just completely removed all horror and replaced it with tedium, was the house at the end. I say the end, but really this final area took up an inordinate amount of playtime. Overall, this is not a long game to play. An average playthrough would take someone about 4 or 5 hours. But that house, being in that house, took over an hour of that time. Compare that to the end of the Blair Witch Project. From the time that Mike and Heather find the house right here to the end of the movie right here, it's about 4 minutes of screen time. The Blair Witch game has some of this intensity when the player first enters the house and wanders around. The door to the basement is locked, so Ellis has to find the key. At first, the geography of the house makes sense, and there's a lot of environmental detail in the wrecked walls and furniture, and of course the sounds of a thunderstorm outside that enhance a sense of entrapment. Little does the player know that what took the movie 4 minutes takes the game designers over 10 times that. After the first go-around inside the house and finding the key to the basement, we enter another dimension. I guess Ellis is looking for Peter down there, but what he finds instead is an extended journey into a dissociative fugue state, combining flashbacks with hallucinations. The house becomes a frustrating maze where you have no idea where you're going or what you're supposed to do, and we see the same rooms over and over again. The number of doors you have to open is preposterous. I'm not exaggerating when I say Ellis opens over 50 doors inside this house. I'm tempted to say how many times Ellis went up and down a flight of stairs, which are probably in the dozens, but some of that was backtracking that could have been avoided. Opening a closed door, though, is not a backtrack. It's something the game wants you to do, over 50 times. And in between these recycled entrances and exits, all the backstory comes in. We see Ellis in the war, we see him at the convenience store, we see him introduced to Bullet for some reason, and while we're piecing all of this together, Ellis hears creepy voices. The killer, Carver, keeps mocking him, while the Blair Witch keeps beckoning to him. These voices keep repeating the same messages over and over, while the flashbacks keep flashing, and I keep opening up door after door and going up and down the stairs, wishing I could just get somewhere already. Just take me, Blair Witch, and end this game. By the time the ending arrives, I'd be satisfied with anything as long as it was the end. Compare this to the movie, where the ending left you thinking, what happened? And the more you thought about it, the scarier it was. That's horror. The ending of this game was so meaningless I can only remember it on the replay. And it still doesn't resonate, even after being reminded of what happened. There are apparently 4 different possible endings. In my ending, Bullet the dog survived, and so did Ellis. But Ellis ends up becoming the new killer after slaughtering Carver. And I guess that's a quote-unquote bad ending. The quote-unquote good ending, it turns out, is letting Ellis get killed so the player can break the cycle of violence and defy the Blair Witch. But the only way to get that ending is to pick up precisely 0 figurines and totems that are found throughout the game world, which is totally counterintuitive to ordinary gameplay. You see something you can grab, especially in a puzzle game, you grab it. Somehow this ordinary gameplay activity turns Ellis into a monstrous serial killer. Meanwhile, the whole premise of the game's story, finding Peter Shannon, is just one of a list of items in an all-text epilogue saying what happened to the characters. Some of this is a little odd. It seems really important what happened to the sheriff and this Todd McKinnon. I had to remind myself who that was. It was that body in the sawmill. Yeah, but does Ellis know him? It turns out that earlier in the game, Ellis actually sees the murder of Todd McKinnon on one of those tapes left by Carver. But there's no real connection between Todd and Ellis, which is strange because it's the very last plot point of the game before the credits. This is the thing we're supposed to think about when the credits are rolling. This is the ultimate problem with the Blair Witch game. It doesn't explain what needs to be explained, and it over-explains what doesn't need to be explained. As a creepy adventure game, it has moments of dread and mystery. But as a horror game, it lacks a compelling connection between the player and the player character. In the Blair Witch Project, Heather, Josh, and Mike didn't have elaborate backstories. They seemed like ordinary people, and that makes the horror so much more effective. What scares them scares us. In the Blair Witch game, however, what scares Ellis is and isn't what would scare anybody. Sure, a creepy forest, a creepy house, demons on the attack, yeah, that'll scare anybody. But in the end, it turns out that what really scares Ellis, based on this extraordinary, elaborate, and tragic backstory, is Ellis himself. Since we don't know that until the very end, for most of the game we are effectively removed from the psychology of the character we're playing. And then, by the time we do figure it out, it's too late to do anything about it except to say, well, what happened there was very specific to Ellis. This wouldn't happen to anybody but Ellis. So where's the horror? There's nothing to be scared of at all. Just don't be Ellis. Thanks for watching.